Good afternoon, and welcome to the next installment of the Spring 2021 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian. I'm Kevin Wisniewski. I'm the Director of Book History here at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. I am also joined here by AAS Library Assistant Amanda Condick. I'd also like to welcome all newcomers here and briefly introduce the American Antiquarian Society. The Society was founded in 1812 by Patriot printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society here located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We are devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and prior to the pandemic, we welcomed scholars and researchers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Before I introduce today's guest, Amanda will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. So before we get started, I do have a few notes on the mechanics of our Zoom webinar format. The chat function is open, so feel free to send your comments to all attendees and panelists throughout the presentation. I'll also be posting additional information and links in the chat relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIBAC. And you should also be able to save your chat by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat. For the Q&A portion of this program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions for Lucas during or after his presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you'll also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon, and we'll get to these at the end of the program. And finally, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this program. So for those who could not attend, or for those of you who would like to rewatch it, we will be posting it on the AAS YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. And Kevin, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest. Lucas Dietrich is Adjunct Professor of Humanities at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Visiting Lecturer of English at Framingham State University. Lucas is also a council member and former president of the New England American Studies Association. His research focuses on 19th century American literature, critical ethnic studies, and the history of the book. Lucas has been the recipient of a Northeast Modern Language Association Fellowship at the Newberry, a Director's Scholarship at Rare Book School, and an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia. He has published articles in the journals Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States, Book History, and papers of the Bibliographical Society of America. He joins us today to share portions of his first book, Writing Across the Color Line, U.S. Print Culture and the Rise of Ethnic Literature, 1877 to 1920, published by the University of Massachusetts Press as part of their series Studies in Print Culture and the History of the Book. And for those who would like to purchase a copy online, Lucas and UMass Press has generously offered a discount code, which Amanda and I will share in the chat during the talk. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Lucas Dietrich.
Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you for that introduction, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin and Amanda, for organizing this. You know, the Antiquarian Society, and especially the program in the history of the book and American culture, were really significant to me during my research and my graduate study. I think back behind me here, I have the stack of books here from this series, and those were sort of my go-to with so much of my research. And so I'm so pleased to be here and to be a part of this series. I've been able to attend some of the other talks in this series, and so I'm humbled to be a part of this. So here's the cover and the title of my book, Writing Across the Color Line. And I wanted to begin by talking about the title as a sort of overview. One thing that I'm trying to do with this project, the way I'm thinking about the color line is not strictly in terms of a racial dividing line between Black and white, but more so in sort of global terms of how whiteness sort of creates a barrier and a boundary around itself and tries to create and separate out others. This was something that Du Bois talked about when he spoke about the color line and said that it belts the globe and that it's a relationship between the lighter and darker people around the world. And so really the relationship that I'm trying to trace in the book is when authors of color and ethnic authors are trying to use commercial literary publication to reach across that line and trying to reach and influence a white audience. And so that's part of the dynamic that I'm trying to trace throughout this book. The other thing that's worth noting here is the timeline of my project. It sort of picks up right where the Antiquarian Society's collections end. I know that they are interested in all American materials up through the 100th anniversary of 1876. And so I think that in this talk, I'm going to have some interesting connections with the sort of earlier 19th century, but we can also think of this as a sort of extension of the collections. So in the late 19th century, there was sort of this wave of multi-ethnic literature in the United States. Here's a list of all these sort of authors of color that were publishing at this time. And, the part of what's new for these authors is their access to major industrial commercial trade. So, of course, writers of color, African-American authors have been writing fiction and publishing their poetry for hundreds of years. But what's new for these authors is that they found ways to gain access to commercial literary publication and to use the commercial industrial publication industry to sort of circulate their work throughout the country. And so they were able to really, in a sense, address a national audience. And that's, again, a major part of what I was trying to track here. Now, oftentimes when literary critics have talked about this, the emergence of these multi-ethnic authors, they've talked about it in stylistic terms. So one thing that many of these authors did was they drew on these popular stylistic elements, and they also kind of often subverted them. So dialect writing was very popular at the time, writing in a sort of slang. Regionalism was incredibly popular. So not only the stories being about New England or the South or the Midwest, but the authors would identify with them, right? And being Western writers or Southern writers. There was also caricature and tricksterism were sort of in vogue at this time. So as the nation was sort of expanding, to the West Coast, and its boundaries were expanding and immigrant populations were changing, there was this interest in, sort of what is the makeup of the US nation. And what most of the authors do is they draw on these styles, but they find ways, really subtle ways, to sort of parody them and subvert them and twist them. And so because of the social dynamic of like trying to enter a predominantly white space, they are sort of compelled to use some of these similar techniques. one of my questions going into the project then was, if so many of these authors are using these sort of subversive, trickster, double voice techniques, did readers understand this? Did their editors know about it? Was it something that was advertised or marketed? And so I became interested in how the literature itself sort of circulated in time. This is a really well-known model for this. It's from Robert Darnton in Daedalus, 1982. And this is what he called his communication circuit. And this is the idea that, you know, books have a sort of material life, that when they travel, they go from a creation of an author and publisher to being printed, shipped, sold, and then going to readers. And then you have this dotted line as from the reader to the author, because the reader's criticisms and comments and reviews might then influence and affect the author's future style. So this is relatively well known to book historians, but I put it here as a sort of model for one of the things I'm trying to do, which is to actually trace how the book circulated. And when you have this this unequal power dynamic and you know, these sort of racism at play throughout this publishing circuit, then what happens in this interaction? Here's a way to think about what my own project does, which is we have these late 19th century authors of color. And again, I'm specifically interested in authors who were trying to target a national audience. Of course, there were Black authors who were more radical, who were writing for their own communities, or, you know, wanted to always speak their truth and not make compromises. But with my project, I'm always interested in this sort of gray area of trying to enter a sort of commercial marketplace. So the authors that I'm examining somehow managed to gain publisher support. And this involves production, distribution, marketing. And sometimes, in some cases, the publishers were surprisingly supportive. You find letters that indicate that they were very aware of the sort of trickster, subversive elements of these texts. In some cases, the publishers spent a great deal of money to try to advertise this. And so I'm imagining the late 19th century, or I'm trying to historicize the late 19th century as this period of really significant potential for this type of writing. And for the publishers, it's very experimental for them. But in terms of the reception and the reading of this work, I find that this great potential of this era of multi-ethnic literature in this era is sort of foreclosed by readers and by reviewers in the commercial literary marketplace. And this is a sort of twofold process. On the one hand, the books are often misread as reinforcing racial stereotypes. So if the authors are relying on some form of self-caricature or regionalism, the readers are not seeing through that. They're just absorbing it as a sort of racial caricature, and it's reinforcing racist attitudes. On the other hand, when the books are properly understood, they tend to be harshly rejected and criticized. And so if suddenly the readers realize that there's this tricky element or subversive element to the text, they become upset. And they especially start to say that the book is political and that it's too racially charged and things like this. So we get this sort of twofold reaction that occurs in the commercial marketplace. And this oftentimes then discourages the publishers from generating new material in this vein, right? Is that they are saying, well, there's not really a market for this after all. At the same time, I am also trying to track the idea that the books themselves have a sort of longer term influence, right? So that predominantly white commercial literary marketplace that's reacting negatively to the literature is not the final judgment. And so the books themselves circulate more widely among communities of color. They circulate further into the future and into futurity and posterity. And part of that is because they're produced in these well-made editions, they're distributed, they're held in warehouses. And so in a sense, I want to also kind of argue that the authors were able to change the culture in a sense. They found a way to sort of withstand this criticism and yet produce the work they wanted to. And in a more long-term influence through the book, they are able to sort of change the culture of American ethnic authorship in the 20th century. I'm going to talk about two examples from my book today to get at a little bit of the comparative element. They're from the first chapters of the book, so they're excerpted. These are sort of pieces of the first and second chapter. This is the first example I want to talk about, is María Amparo Ruiz de Burton. She's a Californian author. She was raised in Baja California, and her family was wealthy and land-owning family. She ends up writing some of the first ever Mexican-American novels in English in the United States. And so she's notable for this. And there's some sort of discussion about, can we classify her as Mexican-American or Latina or Hispanic? And I think the best way to understand is that she's Californian. And within the period of her own life, the Californian territory gets absorbed into the United States. So you can see she's born in 1832. The Mexican-American War is happening in 1846, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So she is literally coming of age through this transition. And when she's 16 and the treaty is signed, her family's land is absorbed into the United States, and she becomes an American citizen. Soon after this, when she's just 17 years old, she marries a United States Army, I think he's a captain, and then he becomes a brigadier general. And his name was Henry S. Burton. And so this is why we get her sort of hybrid name here, is Ruiz de Burton. And throughout her life, sometimes she signs letters as like María Burton. And so she could sort of use that hybridity and play off of her identity in different ways. But this marriage with Henry Burton would have been a marriage across geographies. He's a Northeastern United States American. It's across ethnic lines, and it's across religious lines too, because she's Catholic and he's Protestant. When the two were married, she moved to the Northeast with him when he was in the Union Army, and they lived a sort of cosmopolitan life. They lived in Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. She even met President Abraham Lincoln in the White House to discuss her husband's career in the Army. But when her husband died in 1869, she was a widow with 2 children. She returned home to California, and her land was really, her family had still owned the land, but it was being taken. And she fought legal battles for the rest of her life. And these were largely unsuccessful legal battles to try to win back her family's land. These are her 3 book publications. Who Would Have Thought It, 1872, is a novel. Don Quixote de la Mancha is a play that was then published in 1876. And then The Squatter and the Dawn was an 1885 novel. And they're being taught, more frequently today than I would say in any time in the past, really. I became interested in this element. Her first novel in 1872 was published by J.B. Lippincott. And this is one of the major publishers in the United States at the time. And so I became really interested in how did she get this book published by J.B. Lippincott? And so that's kind of what I wanted to know more about. Here's a summary of this first book. And in a way, it centers a Mexican-American girl protagonist, Lola Medina. She is rescued from captivity. She's in California, and she gets rescued from captivity by a New England archaeologist named Dr. Norval. And she has all of this gold and gemstones in her possession. And Dr. Norval takes custody of her and brings her to New England and promises Lola's dying mother that he will take care of her. And so this sort of played on fascination with the sort of gold rush that was happening of course, in the mid-19th century. And Dr. Norval, throughout the novel, proves that he's really an honest man. He's true to his word, but his family is not. He ends up traveling for an archaeological expedition abroad. And while he's away, his wife and his daughters and their minister, who is kind of a caricature of Henry Ward Beecher, they all work together and are plotting to steal Lola's fortune. And so in this element of the novel, there is a really strong critique of white womanhood, of white New England abolitionists, and a sort of really strong hypocrisy inherent in this. At the end of the novel, Lola ends up marrying Dr. Norval's son, who is an officer in the Union Army. And so again, we have this sort of a happy ending imagined as a marriage across cultures. And the two of them decide actually to move to Mexico. And so their relationship then actually re-centers on Mexico. Here's the book itself. And it has a sort of plain front cover and this sort of gold leaf scroll on the spine with the book's name and then the publisher's name. Here's the title page. And the book itself was published anonymously. And this is very significant that she seemed to not want to put her name on this. And part of the idea there is that she might sort of catch readers off guard, or that she wouldn't be judged for her own Californian identity by readers. Now, in the copy of the book that I read at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the back of the book includes almost 10 pages of advertisements. I think it was 8 or 10 pages of advertisements for other J.B. Lippincott books. And so all of these other books are being advertised here. And one thing to notice was that a lot of these books had a sort of sensational style. And so I started to read this book through that lens of sensationalism. And sometimes Ruiz de Burton's work has been read through a critical lens of sentimentalism. But this book, I think, is much more sensational in its style. And I think it was meant to appear alongside J.B. Lippincott's catalog of sensational novels. Now, Lippincott, again, was a massive bookseller. There were some claims that in the mid-19th century, it was the largest book distributor in the world, certainly in the United States. This is, again, for book historians, is a relatively well-known article called A Day at the Bookbindery of Lippincott, Grambo and Company. And this is from 1852 in Godey's Lady's Book. This has actually been republished by Oak Knoll Press. And if you want to understand how mid-19th century, industrial commercial book manufacturing took place, it's actually a great reference. But one thing that the author does in this article is he keeps talking about how massive Lippincott's publication operation is. And he actually goes on at the end of the article and says, I was not meant to write this much. I was mostly meant to talk about bookbinding. And I just kept seeing more and more things that I wanted to talk about. And so he sort of, justifies the length of the article at the end. Here's another image of Lippincott's. This is the image itself is from an 1887 Publishers Weekly magazine. And this is an image of the J.B. Lippincott Company with a factory annex. That large section that is sort of built on the back half of the building was added in 1871. And so you can actually look at this and you can trace the little explanation there and see all the different departments and how the book was produced and manufactured. And of course, it has this enormous American flag on the front of the building. Now, I wanted to get more into the relationship between Ruiz de Burton and Lippincott, and I ended up going to the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which are in adjacent buildings. And the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has Lippincott Company records. These were sort of thought to be lost for a long time because the company had a fire in the 1890s. And they were sort of, my understanding is that they were assumed to have been lost and destroyed. And you can see there's some water damage on this copy and some staining. But it turned out that when Lippincott moved buildings, and Lippincott is still active today, they moved buildings in the early 2000s, and they had moving boxes with all these materials, and they donated them to the Historical Society. So this was just in the past 20 years that they were donated. And, you know, there's hundreds of, I don't know how many linear feet, it's like 100 linear feet of materials. And they actually are sort of still in need of archival processing because it would be such a huge undertaking to process them all. And so when I was looking at these in the Historical Society, they were coming out in sort of the cardboard moving boxes that they were packaged in. But this is correspondence with Ruiz de Burton, and I wasn't sure if I would really find anything in here, but from the first days that I started looking at it, I was finding letters and materials related to her. And to my knowledge, you know, critics have not talked about this. They certainly haven't been like transcribed and published, you know, in the book of her correspondence that we have. This is from about 20 years later, and this is more correspondence with Ruiz de Burton. And here, it's actually switched over to a more modern carbon copy rather than the previous one was a sort of tissue paper that was pressed into the ink of the letter while it was still wet. And so this is a more modern carbon copy. This was something that I was really excited to see. This slide and the next one are ledger entries for the book itself. So this is a ledger entry for the production of Who Would Have Thought It. And on this page, and then on the next page, you have sort of two sides to the book. And on one side, on the verso, you have all the costs of the book. So this says it was $367 to manufacture it, and that the book cost over $1,000, $1,015 to manufacture, and they made 750 copies. On the other side, on the recto page, this is about the sort of income that they made from the book. And so this is mostly recording sales. And so some of these are just sales that they record semi-annually in December and June. But some of these are specific sales to specific people and even mentions their addresses. So I was sort of fascinated to see that I could trace some of the distribution of this book. And one thing that this says is that the book itself, that Ruiz de Burton paid the company $500 cash to have the book produced. And so one thing that this indicates is that she had paid them, right? We could think of this, I mean, as a sort of commission printing or a sort of form of self-publishing where she had paid them to do this. And so in a sense, you know, based on my project, this is a little disappointing to find out that editors didn't seek her out and accept her work. It turns out that this type of publishing was really significant and important for J.B. Lippincott as a company. So throughout their records for so many of their books, they do this with other authors. They have a really small print run of 500 copies or 750 copies, and they actually describe it as their job printing department. Job printing department, I think most of the time in the 19th century means a publisher is doing like a job. They'll print a poster or a flyer or a leaflet for a commission for a price. But here, they actually, because of the extraordinary size and capabilities of their facility, they were able to publish start to finish entire books. And they do this with a lot of books. And this is sort of the accounting for how they do this. So again, we have this sort of massive production, and this is part of Ruiz de Burton's publishing history. And of course, we can view this as sort of exploitative. Ruiz de Burton, in her correspondence, the company's telling her she still owes them a little bit of money. Like she still owes them $40, and she never pays it. She never like closes out the account. And at a certain point after the fire, they write it off to their insurance costs. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize that through this form of self-publishing commission printing, Ruiz de Burton achieves some things that she would not have been possible if she had tried to sort of self-publish on her own. So the company kept her book listed in their catalog. They kept her book in the warehouse for more than 20 years. And if anyone ever wanted to buy it, they would ship it. The cost sheets show that they would ship copies of the book to anyone that Ruiz de Burton requested, free of charge. They advertised her book in other copies. So in the back of different novels or different books, they would have had a little, 8-page version of their catalog with her novel being mentioned. And then the other thing that I think is really significant is that the book itself appeared like any one of these other Lippincott sensational novel publications. So I really think that when Ruiz de Burton approached them, she probably hoped to make some money off of it. But I think one thing she was trying to do was to put her novel on a bookseller's shelf next to other Lippincott sensational novels. And I think she was writing the novel in this sort of style, and she even titles it in the style. They have other books at the time called Must It Be? And so she has this kind of same style as those books. And she wanted it to appear on the sort of, in the catalog and alongside these other novels, so that maybe someone who likes those novels would purchase it. And then as they enter into the novel, they get all of this sort of subversive content about New England white women and, illicit affairs with a minister and stealing gold and gemstones from this Mexican girl. And so I think she wanted to sort of lure readers into this content. I'm going to turn now to another example. This is Charles W. Chesnutt's The Conjure Woman, which was published by Houghton Mifflin, 1899. And Houghton Mifflin was in many ways like an imprint of prestigious literature at this time. So Houghton Mifflin was the successor to Ticknor and Fields, who had published Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau. Houghton Mifflin was also the parent company to the Atlantic Monthly magazine. And so for many readers, Houghton Mifflin and the Atlantic in the last decades of the 1800s were sort of a mark of quality literature. And Chesnutt, so this is the first book of African-American fiction, or first book of fiction published by a known African-American author with Houghton Mifflin. And Chesnutt, we know from his letters, was proud of this achievement. They had just published their first book of African-American poetry a few years prior through Paul Laurence Dunlop. Now here is Charles Chesnutt He is he's a light-skinned African-American who was sort of capable of passing or being perceived as white, although he never made the decision to do that actively. He was born just prior to the Civil War as a free person of color in North Carolina. And he lived there for the very first few years of his life. And then he always sort of moved back and forth between Cleveland, Ohio, and North Carolina. So when the Civil War began, his family fled North Carolina for Cleveland, Ohio, where they had family. And then after the Civil War ended, they returned to North Carolina, and Chesnutt was a student in schools, the Freeman schools that were founded. And he was an excellent student. He became a teacher and a principal in those schools. As Jim Crow segregation and violence started to increase by the 1880s, Chesnutt again left North Carolina. He tried to live in New York City for a few months, but then ended up continuing on to Cleveland, Ohio. He was married and had 3 children, and he became a lawyer. He passed the bar exam, and then he actually ended up starting a stenography business, a court reporting business that was very successful. So he was quite successful as a businessman, and sort of lived the life of a relatively like upper middle class affluent business person. He wrote fiction throughout his life. There's a really long span in his life where he's writing fiction and essays, but he was most active publishing as like a public author right at the turn of the century, from like 1899 to 1905. Chesnutt's first book, The Conjure Woman, plays on this sort of what's known as plantation fiction at the time. Plantation fiction is like the Brer Rabbit stories that some of us may know because they were continued in Disney's Song of the South. These Brer Rabbit stories were taken from African-American folk tradition by a white author named Joel Chandler Harris. And he used them in his Uncle Remus stories, which were also published by Houghton Mifflin. And these were extraordinarily popular. And the stories were, they actually expressed a certain nostalgia for antebellum life and nostalgia for slavery. And so they had this Black freedman narrator who was sort of a caricature, and he would always sort of express nostalgia for when the plantation was like one big happy family. And so you have a white author using this sort of Black narrator to do this. Chesnutt drew on the style of the plantation tales with this first book. He named his Black freedman narrator Uncle Julius instead of Uncle Remus. And he kind of sets up the story in the same way. But Chesnutt's stories in The Conjure Woman are really haunted by intense violence. In one of the stories, a character asks the Conjure Woman to transform him into a pine tree so that he can escape his plantation and be with the woman who he's in love with. And then while he's transformed into a pine tree, the tree itself is cut down and is milled into lumber. And so there's this very sinister subtext that's sort of recognizing the intense violence of slavery in The Conjure Woman. But it's written in such a way that a lot of white readers could miss that. And you can see that it's also being marketed right alongside these Uncle Remus plantation stories that it parodied. One marker of this is the rabbits on the cover. I think there's only one mention of a rabbit very briefly in the entire book of The Conjure Woman, but they include the rabbit on here so that people who read Uncle Remus will pick it up. Here's another picture of Chesnutt in an advertising leaflet for the story. And again, he doesn't do anything to deceive an audience, but he kind of has this Mona Lisa smile in terms of, how do we read this portrait of the author? And then inside this leaflet, it opens up there are all these blurbs, and these are the same types of blurbs we would have today, where it's a short excerpt of a review, a positive review of the book. And all of these blurbs compare the book to the Uncle Remus, Joel Chandler Harris stories. They don't note any distinction. They don't note its subversive elements. And Chesnutt was actually okay with this at the time. In his letters, he requests more of these flyers, this exact flyer, which was in the Houghton Library archives, and saying he can use them. But he kind of quickly grew out of this style. And as an author, when he moved on to new books, he was a little bit more aggressive with his tactics. There was another edition of this book that was published, and I became aware of this, and I became interested in this, is that a limited special edition of this book appeared. And here's Chesnutt describing it in an essay that he wrote very late in life in 1931. This is just a year before he died. And it was published for this group of book lovers, bibliophiles in Cleveland, Ohio, who were called the Rofant Club. And they were mostly lawyers in Cleveland. And Chesnutt was affiliated with them. And he later became a member of the club. And the club still exists today. And it actually still exists as an all-male book club. And so it rightfully is criticized for this. But the special edition was 150 numbered copies on a handmade linen paper. I was able to view a copy of this at the Houghton Library in Harvard. And the Houghton Library is actually unrelated to Houghton Mifflin. This is named after an industrial glass manufacturer, Houghton, rather than the publisher. But here it is. And you can see it doesn't have the caricatured image, no reference to the rabbits. It has this paper label, which is a sort of throwback to a certain type of design, and the buckram cover. But when I went to open the book in the Houghton Library, I was surprised the pages in the book were actually uncut. So the book was printed on these large sheets of handmade linen paper, and they were folded up and bound together, but the pages were never trimmed. And so the actual edition in the Houghton Library today is still uncut, and you can't actually turn the pages. This always reminds me, there's an example of this in The Great Gatsby, in Gatsby's library, and Nick encounters this character named Owl Eyes who's looking at the books, and he finds out that they're actually uncut. And he's sort of amazed that Gatsby has gone to all this trouble to get these real uncut books, this sort of collector's item. And it's especially interesting to me that Gatsby is kind of a passing narrative, a story of someone who's wanting to reinvent themselves and recreate themselves in the form of sort of a WASP old money identity. So part of what I'm exploring here is that this sort of situation that Chesnutt is stuck between is this one option of this sort of having to go through this caricature that you sort of reinforce. And then on the other hand, there's this like a much more dignified volume, but is it being read, or is it just still being sort of objectified and fetishized? Chesnutt, again, he became more and more aggressive with his sort of publishing tactics, and his second novel was much more, his second book was more realistic stories about passing and mixed race identity. And then in The House Behind the Cedars, he kind of rewrites the story of the tragic mulatta. And by his fourth and final novel with Houghton Mifflin, he's writing the story of the Wilmington insurrection, which was a sort of white supremacist coup at the time. And he's writing a much more political fiction about those events. And so he sort of, being frustrated with this situation, he moves his authorial style and shifts it so that readers can't necessarily miss his point. But that, in a sense, keeps him from continuing to publish, because readers, white readers at the time, review that book very harshly and critically. All right, I'm almost wrapping up here, my last couple of slides, but in 1904, this is Chesnutt's last publication within the realm of Houghton Mifflin in the Atlantic Monthly. They stopped publishing his novels in 1901 once he gets critically, harshly reviewed by critics. But he gets this one last short story in the Atlantic Monthly. And this is actually a story about a club of book lovers called the Bodleian Club, so referencing Oxford University Library. And the club produces its own collector's editions of books. And the main character in this story, Baxter, produces this book of poems called the Procrustes. And it auctions off at these very high value for the club. But it's actually been sort of sealed with this paper and wax, and nobody wants to open it because that would decrease the value of the book. And at the end of this story, there's this twist where one character opens it and they realize that the book is actually blank. There's no words in the book. And so, in a sense, Chesnutt finds this way to, within the realm of Houghton Mifflin in the Atlantic, publish a criticism of the very experience he's had with these books, where he's not sure that people are really reading it and getting it. But to end on a slightly more positive note, I was able to review a few different copies of this special edition. And one of the copies, this is a different copy of the special edition that's held by the Library Company of Philadelphia. And this one has actually been opened. And it wasn't trimmed by Houghton Mifflin. It was still sold with uncut pages. But somewhere along the line of this copy's history, the book was opened up. And one thing I noticed when I was reading it was that the book was opened, whoever opened it used their pen to cut the edges, because there were these blue dots of ink all around the border. And I've thought about this as one way to sort of describe my project, where there's so much value in returning to these books, opening them up, spending more time with them, and writing about them and engaging with them as a way to restore the value of them. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas. I appreciate that. We are open for questions. You can go to the Q&A function at the bottom of the menu bar and submit your question. Several folks have already done so, and remember that you're also able to upvote questions. So if you've seen one that kind of mirrors yours, instead of duplicating that, you can simply vote that up. Lucas, I'd like to kind of start things off, if I may, and actually kind of look back at one of your earlier slides, which is the one in which you showed Darnton's communications network.
Sure.
One of the major themes in your book is really kind of dedicated to publishing strategies. I'm going to let you get to that slide first.
Sure, yeah, sorry, I'm kind of like clicking.
No, it's okay. I didn't want to.
Okay, so here we go.
There we go. There we are. Okay, so one of the major themes in your book is thinking about publishing strategies, and specifically individual authors' strategies in reaching specific audiences, specific readerships. Of course, we also see in your book, and it's something that didn't quite play out here in full today, that editors and publishers and authors often have very different goals, very different values, very different agendas regarding books. Could you talk a little bit more about the ways in which first you were able to kind of identify authorial intent, but then also the ways in which you kind of untangled those kind of negotiations or frictions between authors and their editors or publishers.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I run into this issue with, like, you know, what are the author's intentions and this intentional fallacy. And I often kind of get this question about, like, well, how do you know that that's a sort of misreading? And I think there are some ways where we can judge that and say, you know, there's correspondence from the author. There's the way the authors sort of respond to and talk about criticism and the way they change their style from one book to the next. And I think too is that when you see the criticism in the Conjure Woman and you see that and are able to read it, that it's a compelling reading. It's a compelling reading of the text. And so I think that in a sense, the literary critics have sort of established that there's these, so much of this literature has these subversive elements, and you start to see it and you sort of feel it must be there. And so the idea that so many readers are missing it is, I feel okay, like, labeling that and calling it that. The interactions with authors and their publishers and editors, I mean, I'm usually going with correspondence. And so there you can see this sort of behind the scenes, what is happening. In another chapter, I'm looking at W.E.B. Du Bois and the publication of The Souls of Black Folk. And it becomes clear that the editors in that case knew that Du Bois was a borderline celebrity already. They were trying to, they actually solicited The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois was doing all of his scholarship and the Atlanta conferences, and he didn't think to publish a collection of essays. And so actually what happens with The Souls of Black Folk is a Chicago publisher, A.C. McClurg, is trying to sort of poach his Atlantic stories, and they solicit and convince him to publish The Souls of Black Folk, which he does not think is going to be successful. And he ultimately agrees. And when he publishes that, you know, he's imagining The Souls of Black Folk as a more popular effort. He's trying to sort of reach this white reader. And you see it in the prologue where he's saying, like, gentle reader, like, come along with me and forgive me. And Du Bois doesn't really believe that. I mean, from his perspective, he has something to teach the white reader that they're intensely, like, not aware of. And so then the correspondence with the publishers, the editors are, they're willing to accede to Du Bois. They suggest editorial changes, and he says, no, I want to keep that. And it ends up in the book. And they ask him about how he wants the book designed, and he wants, you know, they do a black cover with gold, and they do a gold edging around the paper. And so he's involved in all of this. But I think the situation changes from author to author. For Chesnutt, he wanted to write his big novel, and the editors convinced him to do these Conjure stories because they thought, okay, we know this is popular. But then once he had his foot in the door, he kind of changes his style and pushes further and further.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the things I also liked today that you kind of briefly mentioned in your response there was the way in which the form of the book, the way in which publishers produce that book kind of correspond to the readerships that they kind of intended. That kind of leads me as a sort of transition to my next question, which Melanie Hernandez today also kind of anticipated, and that was identifying those readerships. I think you mentioned to some extent Chesnutt's today, specifically his critics, but I was wondering, and actually Melanie was also wondering, if you could provide some specific examples from Ruiz de Burton's readership.
Yeah, so Ruiz de Burton, and sort of within the book, she's like a little bit of a predecessor. She's on the earlier end of what I'm looking at, in comparison to some of the other books. But her books are not very widely read. There's only this one print run of 750 copies, and a good handful of those copies remain in storage for the next 20 years. But her book does get out there. The reviews of this book are pretty minimal. There's only 3 or 4 of them to my knowledge, and they tend to be a little bit critical of her being more political with the critique. And so, Melanie, you mentioned your question, she's not at all subtle. But the subtlety here, I think, comes in the packaging, right? And so it's packaged to look just like all of these other books in Lippincott's catalog. And again, they had sensational books by Ouida, the Anglo-French sensationalist. They had all of Ouida's books. They have this other German sensationalist, E. Marlitt, and those books are very popular for them. And they have all these other titles in this series. And so, to me, Ruiz de Burton is very much trying to write in that style and trying to have the book appear like those, so that someone who's interested in that style might pick it up. And then as they go through it, and in Who Would Have Thought It, it's about 40 pages into the novel, and you actually start to get this almost like a Spanish language narrator. She has this narrative interjections that say "Quien sabe," and it actually says "Who knows." And so it's 40, 50 pages into it, and we get this little interjection, and I'm reading it going, wait a second, the sort of third person omniscient narrator is speaking Spanish. And so, to me, I mean, that those elements are a little subtle, even while she's more openly political.
Thank you. I think your response there also kind of addressed another question here regarding Ruiz de Burton's style, asking the question if she included Spanish phrases in the novel.
Well, I don't know if I saw that, but yeah, she does. And again, one of the things to me was that they came from the narrator. And one of the first times the narrator kind of interjects is to say "Quien sabe." And I have this piece in the chapter where I talk about how that's tied to knowledge, who knows? And that's tied to the title of the book, Who Would Have Thought It? And so part of the unstated answer to that question is that any Californian, Latina reader of this book would have thought this. And so I think that's this sort of element that's sort of behind the text throughout the novel.
Still looking at Ruiz de Burton, we have another question regarding how you kind of categorize or identify the novel. And you've referred to the novel as sensational rather than sentimental. So we're kind of wondering why you use the term sensational. Do others use that?
I think that I would categorize The Squatter and the Dawn, her second novel, as much more sentimental. But the sensational aspect is, you have this Lola Medina's character who she's in captivity. She's actually in captivity to a Native American tribe. And so we see some of Ruiz de Burton as this sort of wealthy, upwardly mobile American citizen who has this sort of racism towards Blacks and indigenous tribes, toward African American. So Lola Medina has been in captivity to an indigenous tribe. They've dyed her skin black, and then her skin slowly turns more white throughout the novel. She somehow, while being in captivity in California, has this vast hoard of gold and gemstones worth millions and millions of dollars. And then when she travels to New England, Dr. Norval's wife is scheming with their minister and is actually having an affair with the minister as they scheme to steal Lola's money. And so it's much more in the vein of sensationalism than sentimentalism. And I think that Ruiz de Burton is also aware that the West and California and expansion is always sort of sensationalized as sort of cowboys and shootouts. And so I think she's there again is this sort of meta commentary on this sort of sensational depiction of California.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. So I want to get one more in. Of course, those questions that did not get answered today will be forwarded to Lucas, and hopefully they'll be answered in one fashion or another at a later date. This last question, though, comes from a current fellow here at AAS, John Garcia, who asks the following. How common did publishers engage in vanity publishing or printing to order for novels or other lengthy works before Ruiz de Burton? Would you say that she was the first minority author to use this method?
Thanks. Hi, John. And I will definitely try to get around to the other questions if I can have them. I would love to like type up responses. I'm not sure about the answer to this question. And, I think that I've become really interested in like, how do we conceive of this? Like, part of it is to say, you could say that Lippincott is exploiting the vanity of its authors to make money. And I think that like, that's really true in a sense. But again, also, Ruiz de Burton could not have printed and published this book. If she had paid the extra little amount of money she owed, then they would have given her the plates and given her the copyright that they produced essentially at cost. And meanwhile, she would have sold all these books as well. And so I think like vanity I tend to like the term of like commission printing and job printing a little bit better. But I want to make sure I'm trying to answer the question. I know that the Antiquarian Society has a project going on about Black self-publishing, right? And when you look at Harriet Wilson and you look at the sort of self-publishing that's happening there, it becomes a possibility or an option for these authors who like cannot enter the commercial trade press. And that's also something that so there's a lot of Black authors who are using that possibility. And I don't think that is either like strictly vanity publishing as well. But I do agree that Ruiz de Burton's case is a little bit closer to what we would call vanity publishing. And I can say that this was extremely common at Lippincott. When you go through their books and they have ledgers for all of their books, so many of their titles are like this, just 500 copies of a book that they're doing as a job printing. And it's a big part of their business to make money off of it. And so who knows all the other like authors that are involved, in those books. But I think it's a really interesting question, especially in terms of the distinctions between self-publishing, vanity publishing, commission publishing, job printing, and what those things like afford.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've only scratched the surface here. I think we've asked a lot of questions that are incredibly intriguing. We have a lot more to go. I do encourage you to check out Lucas's book. There's a lot of really great passages in there. In particular, some great readings on, and there's a picture in the slideshow earlier regarding account books and looking at these business papers and archival papers of these publishers. So really wonderful job. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap up. So Lucas, I would like to kind of start by thanking you for joining us today.
Thanks so much. My pleasure. Really, really happy to give this talk. Thank you.
And Amanda just added a link to the Black Self-Publishing project that Lucas alluded to at the very end a moment ago. I would like to offer a big thank you to everyone in attendance today. Our next talk takes place on April 29th and features Caretha Mitchell, who will discuss her book, From Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African-American Culture. So I hope to see you there. And until then, thank you.